Now, for several weeks, we have been looking at paragraphs of Paul's letter to the Ephesians that help the Ephesian church become a healthier, holier version of itself. Now, we're not actually changing that topic, okay? That is really what all of the second half of this letter is about, including the parts we're going to study over the next 5 or 6 weeks. Paul even structures his grammar to make sure we understand that, even as he transitions to some new topics. Nevertheless, there are new topics to be explored. The German scholars used to call this section the Haushaltsfilm, the household code. And it is a section of Paul's letter that has elicited no small amount of controversy over the past 50 or 75 years. I think some scholars would also say that it is a section of Paul's letter that has created much mischief in the history of the church. We'll explore why that is in a little while. Nevertheless, we can't just ignore these texts, because it is in this household code, which is really 5:21 through 6:9, that we learn how the gospel impacts our daily lives. So here's what we're going to do over the next 5 weeks. Okay? This morning we're going to start with an overview of the context. And we're not just going to focus on Paul's context, we're going to talk about our own context as well. It's vitally important that we do that, because if we don't, we can very easily misinterpret Paul's teaching. Then we're going to look at 4 ideas, 4 themes, 4 concepts that frame Paul's teaching in the household code, and especially in his discussion of marriage. Okay? Now, let me just stop and say this. We're going to focus a lot on marriage, okay? Because marriage is important for the entire household. We'll see why that is in a moment. But also because marriage is important in its own right, as Paul explains in this text, okay? So even in our discussions this morning, we're going to focus a lot on the issues related to, I should say, marriage, which means we're talking about gender and lots of other things, okay? Now, then we're going to address specifically Paul's instructions to wives and then Paul's instructions to husbands. I may switch that order. I haven't decided. I keep changing my mind about which order to do all of that in, okay? And then finally, we're going to go to the subordinate members of the household, children and slaves. And what we're going to see there is that this household is something kind of alien to us. And so we can't just draw straight lines from Paul's instruction to our lives. Our lines are going to have to zigzag a little bit. And we'll explore why on that Sunday, but we're going to explore why this morning too. So that's going to be kind of our bookends to this discussion. Now, what are we doing this morning? Okay, we're going to start with a couple of initial questions. Then we're going to do a historical overview. And then, time permitting, we're going to address the theological context. That discussion, the theological context, is going to look long. It's not going to be. It's going to be shorter than you think. Okay? So let's get started, because we got a lot of ground to cover. So what are these two initial questions? Well, they're raised by the very title of this message. You may have seen it projected up on the screen and gone, the Christian household? What is he talking about? Aren't we supposed to be talking about family here? Well, even though the Roman word, the Latin word familia, is the word that we get our English word family from, the Roman household is not our nuclear family. Okay? So if it's not our nuclear family, then why would Paul care about it? That's our second question, right? So what is a household and why would Paul care about it? Well, when we talk about the Roman household, we are talking about the building block upon which Rome built its society. The Romans saw the household as the foundation of their society, and the household was supposed to mimic, if you will, Roman society as a whole. Okay? So, who all is part of the household? Well, the household is built around a male head. Okay? A male head. Now, sometimes in astronomy, you have a binary star system, right? There's two stars that kind of rotate around each other, and the solar system of that particular star system has two stars in the sky. That would be the Jewish family. Remember what the Ten Commandments say. Honor your father and mother, right? And over again in the Old Testament, we have this formula. Father and mother, father and mother. And even sometimes they'll put father and mother in parallel structure to each other in a proverb, like, a fool shames his father and gives disgrace to his mother, right? Okay? That's a sort of this binary star system. The Roman family, if you want to call it that, it's household, really, and I'll explain why here in a moment, revolves around a single head. There's a single star at the center of that solar system, more like our own, right? That's the male head. Now, I'm going to be dialoguing throughout our discussion with a book by Michelle Lee Barnwell called Neither Complementarian Nor Egalitarian. And that title will make more sense towards the end of our sermon this morning. But one of the brilliant things that Lee Barnwell does in her book is that she draws out how this male head is viewed differently than we view headship or leadership or anything like that. Our society, even outside of the church, has been deeply influenced by a Christian ethic in which the leader sacrifices himself or herself, his well-being or her well-being for the group. So even in, secular, hedonistic America, you'll see a CEO in a company. Everybody thinks their life is great, but the truth is they're working 80-hour weeks, 100-hour weeks to make sure the company holds itself together. Just recently, I heard about a Navy SEAL commander who wrote a book on leadership, and part of what he was saying is, listen, you can't get men and women to put themselves in mortal peril just simply on the basis of authority. They have to trust you. They have to love you. And part of that means they have to know that you will put yourself on the line for them too. Right? That's not how the Romans thought about headship. For them, the head is the most important part of the body. Because I think what it makes me think of an old Bill Cosby joke. You know, it's sort of like the head is saying, hey, I can always get another body. The head in the Roman mindset is what holds it all together. The head is what gives it leadership. The head is what gives it direction. Without a head, a body is directionless. This was very formative in the Roman mind. Okay? So, you have to have that point squared away in your head in order to really understand what the Romans were doing and therefore understand how revolutionary Paul's teaching was. Okay? Now, along with that central male head, there was a wife, usually. There were sons and unmarried daughters. Okay? And the sons, if their wives had given birth to sons, they were part of the household too. There's a little bit of a weird thing here in Roman law where a wife does not actually transfer to the household of her husband until she gives birth to a son. It's very strange. But it shows you the privilege that they place on masculinity. Right? Okay? But here's the thing. The Roman household does not work like a nuclear family. Because it is not just the building blocks upon which Roman society was built, but it is also the foundational unit of economic production. So, you've got slaves and other hired workers. Now, what are you already noticing? I want you to think about this, okay, for just a second. What is it that you're already noticing about the structure of this household? It's hierarchical, isn't it? You've got, and there are levels to this, okay? And then you've got all these other adjunct people who are just kind of floating around out there. Some of them are friends. Some of them are people who need favors, usually from the male head, but sometimes a wife would have people who depend upon her or her patronage, or maybe an oldest son would have people who depend on him, that kind of thing. These are people, we call them clients, who need stuff from this family, right? So there's a whole lot of people, and then there's just other hangers on who are just kind of around. Do they play some role in the household and how it runs? Yes. It used to be thought that the male pater familias, the head, okay, it used to be thought that he made all decisions by fiat. And some scholars still believe that that's how it worked. Others have argued that what you have here is a male head with a family council around him, okay? And he brings things to this council and they work by consensus building. In that instance, you would bring in friends and people who you trust to come and help you make these important family decisions. The truth probably varied quite wildly from one family to another. Some were probably entirely run by the male head. Some were probably more consensus oriented, okay? But either way, no one in the ancient world questions whether the man is the head of the household. Okay? Now, that's important because of the values that are inculcated into this family structure. Those values are order, stability, and honor. Honor of the family, but particularly honor of its male head. Okay? This is the world in which Paul lived. And it was the world he had to navigate. But I want you to keep those values in your mind, because we're going to come back at the very end today to some kingdom values. And I want you to think in your own mind how those kingdom values line up with these characteristic Roman values: order, stability, and honor. Okay? Now, why would Paul care about the household? Let's do this real quick. We know he cares about the household because it's a fundamental unit of Roman society. But there's another reason. House churches were regularly built upon the framework of a household. Now, let me tell you a story. It's a story that comes from Paul's own life, right? You'll recognize it. Paul gets to Philippi. He looks around for some Jewish people that he can kind of connect with to do his missionary activity. He finds some women out by a river praying, and some of them come to know Jesus, right? One of those women is named Lydia. And Lydia says to Paul, hey, if you really consider me a believer, come and stay with me. So he does, right? Now let me ask you something. What happens as that household, as Paul stays in that household? Lydia's got slaves for sure. She's got other hired workers. She may even have children, right? And all of a sudden, Paul's sharing the gospel with these people. And now you got maybe, you got a couple of kids that come in. And then you got 5 or 6 slaves who come in. And then you've got 3 or 4 other hired workers who come in. And then you got, wait a minute, there's these 2 guys over here who owe Lydia money and they need some help, right? All of a sudden, shazam, you've got a church, right? All right there in Lydia's household. Now, why do I tell you that story? 2 reasons. One, it illustrates the close connection between household and church. And you should automatically be thinking, what happens if a couple of Lydia's slaves get really upset with her? How is that going to impact the church? Okay? But I tell you that story for another reason. Did you notice there's no male head? The picture that Paul is painting here in Ephesians 5:21 through 6:9 is an idealized picture. It's one that many of his converts could not relate to because either they were unmarried, or they weren't wealthy enough to own slaves, or they didn't have children, or for a whole host of other reasons, right? Okay? Keep that in your mind. That already builds in some degree of flexibility. Paul's already saying, hey, you're going to have to apply this to the situation in which you are in, and you're going to have to use discernment to do it right. And that's what really brings us to our historical overview, okay? That's where we need to kind of talk about a couple of things. The first thing we need to talk about is Paul's own context, okay? Paul's context. In other words, women in Ephesus. Now, Lynn Cohick reminds us that this is of 2 things, really. A, this is a very much status-driven culture. Status is everything. And when you hear the word status, you should think honor in public. Okay? Honor in public. So let me give you a modern example that makes no sense to us, but in a different cultural context, it makes all the sense in the world. Our pastor friend, Dennis Wiles at First Baptist Arlington, Arlington has a large Muslim population, and Dr. Wiles was visiting the mosque for one of the mosques in town for some reason. I don't remember the reason now. But for a while, the mayor of Arlington went to First Baptist Arlington. And the mayor and Dr. Wiles were there, and they were talking with the imam. And Dr. Wiles just innocently mentioned that he and the mayor had dinner the other day. And the imam says, "Oh, he must have been truly honored to have dinner with you." Do you understand kind of where the imam is coming from? For him, public honor really matters, right? And it doesn't necessarily flow along the kinds of political pathways that we're used to, all right? So that's the point that Dr. Kohik is trying to make, is that this is an honor culture. It's very much a public status culture. And status is composed of a lot of different things. Yes, one of them is gender, but gender's not everything. And so you have in Ephesus kind of conflicting trajectories. It's almost like two rivers crashing together. One of those rivers is the more traditional view of women. We'll talk about that in a moment. The other is this view of women that is created by the business success that people like Lydia and other entrepreneurial women had. They were able to purchase slaves. They were able to make large amounts of money. They were able to take care of themselves without a man. Okay? Inevitably, that's the kind of social phenomenon that changes a society's viewpoint. Okay? But that was the exception. And this is where I do disagree with Dr. Kohik a little bit, even though I do so advisedly, because she's forgotten more about this stuff than I'll ever know. Gender was, for women, a profound limiting factor in their ability to acquire status. And in fact, the acquisition of public status, of public honor, was considered to be a masculine task. Okay? Now, why was it like that? Why did people think like this? Well, because of one very simple fact. To them, nature was an explanation and justification for class differentiation. Let me say that again. Nature was an explanation of and justification for class differentiation. So if you went back in a time machine and you learned, Ephesian Greek, and you walked into one of the philosophical schools there in Ephesus, other than the Epicureans. You walked into any other philosophical school in Ephesus, any other religious temple, any other public space. You walked into the agora where people are buying and selling stuff, and you said, all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. They would have looked at you like you had 3 heads. Why? Even if your Greek was perfect, they would have looked at you like you had 3 heads. Why? Because to them, they look around and they see, well, men are bigger than women. Especially if I go back in that time machine, I'm 6'2", you know. And that's just the beginning. What they would say is that status difference is encoded into nature and is therefore the product of the divine. It is God's will. Okay? That is simply an assumption that we do not share. Rightly or wrongly, let the feminists and the chauvinists fight that out. Okay? It's just not, it's an assumption that we don't share, and we're not going backwards. This culture is not going backwards, not like that. Okay? Now, this created a circumstance in which status differentiations of all kinds, you should be thinking about this when we get to our conversations about children and slaves later. Status differentiations of all kinds were thought to be God's will. And so, how did this affect women? Well, there are two factors that played a role. First, you'll see on the screen, I've called it Greek gynophobia, fear of women. And this is a factor that is well known among classicists. Greek men did not know what to do with women. Roy, don't say anything. I didn't get it out there fast enough. Greek men, they just did not know what to do with women. You can see it in the mythology. If you've got an old Greek mythology anthology or something on your shelf at home, go back and reread some of this stuff with that lens, and you'll go, oh, I see this. This is interesting. But the main factor was this. Greek and Roman men, and anyone influenced by their culture, which means some Jewish rabbis had this same view. Greek and Roman men defined what it means to be human in terms of rationality. They believed that women were inherently less rational than men. Therefore, women are less human. Now, what does that result in? It results in comparatively low status and almost no legal rights. That was especially true in Greek-dominated areas, slightly less true in Roman areas, and quite a bit less true in Egypt, particularly among the indigenous Egyptian population. Okay? But women had very few rights and were generally deemed to be unreliable, irrational, unworthy of leadership. Now, that prejudiced viewpoint poisoned the medieval church. Period. There is no disputing that fact. Whatever else we believe about what Paul did or did not teach, we cannot escape the fact that Christianity was greatly influenced by this Greco-Roman prejudice. Okay? Now, why is that notion of prejudice important? Well, because every society has prejudices of various kinds. We call them presuppositions. So as we turn to our own context, let's start with the 19th century. Now, we could go all the way back to Abigail Adams, but I want to pick up the story where Lee Barnwell picks up the story, okay? In the 19th century. And you'll notice I've called this the Victorian Consensus and First Wave Feminism. What happens? Well, in the Victorian conception, Women are no longer the inferiors of men, at least in the moral realm. They are the moral superiors of men. As such, it was thought that women had a special responsibility for guarding civic morality. Now, let's say you get back in your time machine and you go to 19th century America and you go to any church or pool hall or tavern and you walk in and you say, "A woman's place is in the home." Nobody's going to argue with you. Not in most cases. Okay? But this is where it gets a little wacky. Because since women were tasked with guarding civic morality, the definition of home kept growing. Okay? These are not people, now they do have some individualistic tendencies, but these are not in the main people who are focused first on individual well-being. They're interested in the common good. That's their primary focus. So when they say a woman's place is in the home, they start out meaning the whole community. Okay? And then it begins to expand to her whole state, and then her nation, and then ultimately the world. You remember, don't you, that this is the period when the missionary movement takes off in the United States, right? And who are the people driving that movement? A lot of them are women. And so you've got, really conservative guys like Dwight L. Moody in the 19th century praising female preachers. Why? Because they said, well, yeah, the Bible says certain things about what men are supposed to do, what women are supposed to do, but the need for world evangelization is too urgent. So if a woman wants to go out there and preach and tell the gospel and tell people to get out of the taverns and to go home and to be good family providers, then have at it. If women want to go out and preach against booze and preach against slavery, well, have at it. Go for it, Betsy. Go tell him. Go tell him. Right? That's what their attitudes were. And it's so interesting. Women were arguing for suffrage on the basis of rights as early as the 1830s, but they didn't really get any traction until first wave feminists were able to say, hey, this is going to be good for the common good. Now, what's weird about this whole story? What's weird about what Lee Barnwell is presenting to us? Well, I'll tell you what's weird about it. Women's suffrage went right along hand in hand with the temperance movement, which gave us prohibition, right? Prohibition was repealed. Women's right to vote was not. It's an interesting historical fact. She does not address why that is. I have a theory. It's just a theory, okay? But I have a theory. We'll come to that in a minute. So, the next phase is the turning of the tide. Okay? 1930 to 1960. Now, what happens? This is a period of great change in American society. Okay? You have these two great national traumas. The Great Depression and World War II. Now, World War II is going to have some impacts that last long beyond this period. But what these traumas do is they get Americans hankering for a peaceful, prosperous life. Can we just have it easy for a while? I mean, we've all had that feeling, haven't we? We've all probably prayed that. Lord, can we take this slow for a little while? You also have a changing value structure. People are less focused on the common good and more focused on the individual, his rights and his benefits. Okay? Now, I use his there intentionally, but we're going to come back and revise that in a little bit. Okay? Now, I'm going to make a connection that Lee Barnwell doesn't make explicitly, and maybe you've never heard it made before, but I think it makes a lot of sense. This is also the period where we see the transition from multi-generational housing to the nuclear family. So we have a transition from multiple generations living together and just expecting that that's going to be how things are, to this model of the nuclear family. Husband, wife, kids. Now, that transition is understandable. Have any of you ever been an adult and tried to live with another adult member of your family? Nelda just did it, right? It's really hard, isn't it, Nelda? Well, I've done it too. And Nelda ain't lying. Even under the best of circumstances, it's really hard. Okay? Because we're just different people. And once you started to see this shift of focus from sort of the common good to the life of the individual, and once you started to see growing prosperity after World War II, you do see this shift to the nuclear family. It changes the way we think. But do you know, there's a lot of people my age and younger, maybe older than that, who don't realize that this shift took place. And they think this is the way that it's always been. Now, another thing that happened was the growth of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism has always been a retarding feature or a retarding trend when it comes to the involvement of women in society. So what do you end up with? Well, what you end up with is a bunch of ladies' magazines in the post-World War II era telling women, leave your jobs in the factories, go home, have kids, take care of your husband, not because it's good for society, although occasionally that argument was made, but more often, way more often, it's good for you. You'll like it better. You'll be more fulfilled. You were made to do this. God made you to do this. You'll be happier this way. Now, as you can imagine, and as we shift into the next period, 1963 to 1979, that was a fragile arrangement. It was a fragile social arrangement. Let's just list off real quickly some of the factors why. The advent of birth control. That means smaller families, less time for women in their child-raising years. It also means women have more choices about when and how and with whom they have a family. We're talking about longer life expectancies, which means that women are going to have to make some decisions about what they do with their life after their kids are gone. We're talking about increased prosperity. We're talking about the fact that women had done these supposedly masculine jobs and had shown that they could do them during World War II. And there are others too, but I think perhaps the most important was education. These, a lot, not, but some of these women were college-educated women. Others were very intelligent high school grads. And they're kind of left at home going, what? Why was that? Because the home was no longer the world. The home wasn't her nation. The home wasn't her state. The home wasn't even her town. It was at most her neighborhood, and sometimes, maybe even often, stopped at her property lines. It was really focused on husband and children. It's a different way of thinking than what was going on in the 19th century. So of course women looked at that. Of course some women loved it. Some women thought it was great. Other women looked at it and said, this is not for me. Some women don't have that kind of, automatic mothering instinct that some people think is just hardwired into you, Just like some men are better fathers than others. It's just the truth. So, another thing that's happening during this same period is the awakening of the American conscience, the civil rights movement. Now, what does the civil rights movement do? It shows, it puts a mirror up in front of America, okay? Now, not everybody saw the same thing when they looked in that mirror, but most people didn't like what they saw. They saw, at least at some level, historic inequalities and how those historic inequalities affected people, okay? And it awakened their conscience to say, hey, wait a minute. We need to be thinking about people's rights and their ability to prosper, not just legally, but socially. Now, Lee Barnwell describes this as an intensification of individualism. I think some of that maybe was taking place, but I think she's actually wrong there. I think what's happening is people are seeing how the life of the individual is connected with the life of society as a whole. I'll come back to that in a moment, okay? Another thing that's happening is that America is becoming disillusioned with the comfortable, prosperous, materialistic life of the 1950s. Yes, there was lots of material prosperity. There was also a lot of emotional distance. And then, finally, there is the transition from rapid family change to rapid familial disintegration. Let me tell you a story to illustrate this, okay? It's my mother's story. She's married by the time she's 19 or 20, has her first child by the time she's 21 and a half. Okay? Standard story, right? Except by the time that she gives birth to my sister, she's divorced. She's going to be a single mother in Arkansas in the 1960s. Now, that sounds like right out of the Focus on the Family playbook, right? Because after all, she's divorced because her husband was cheating on her with another woman. And, oh, by the way, he was a raving alcoholic too. It's amazing. Adultery and alcoholism don't make for good family life. Who knew, right? But this wasn't just a phenomenon that pushed people towards sort of social conservatism. My mother is to the right of Attila the Hun politically, okay? But she was also a single parent in Arkansas in the 1960s who had to figure out a way to provide for my sister, right? That means she has to work. That changes the way you see things, doesn't it? Now, that transitions us quite nicely into our theological overview. Now, what I'm about to present you, these two warring parties, is an oversimplification because each party has a whole continuum of people in it. But it's a conflict that has been brewing for 50 years and continues to be waged That's why Lee Barnwell wrote her book. She wanted to try to reset the conversation. I'll explain how in a moment. She wanted to reset the conversation so that maybe we're not butting heads over the same issues over and over again with nobody making any progress. Now, complementarians and egalitarians agree on a lot of things. They agree that men and women are both created in the image of God. They agree that they're both, they're both worth something equally to God. They agree that they're both saved the same way. The problem, and they both agree that there's a difference between men and women. What they disagree about is whether you remember me saying that status differences in the Roman world could be encoded into nature. That's what they're disagreeing about, essentially. For complementarians, the Bible teaches that men and women have different functions in nature and in the home and in the church and in society. And those different functions, when they suss everything out, men lead, women serve. That's the way they think about it. Egalitarians say, no, I'm sorry, that's not how any of this works. Marriage is not a military unit. You don't have to have one head. It's not a military unit, it's a relationship. And what happens in a relationship is two people work together. And then that relationship provides leadership for their children. Not just leadership in the sort of narrow sense, but modeling. And therefore, women have just as much right to lead as men in whatever arena. Now, of course, again, both of those are huge overgeneralizations, but we have to overgeneralize in order to squeeze all this in. Here's the problem. They both have a question they can't answer. For the complementarians, the question is, well, okay, how can you say that a woman is equal to God before a man when, in fact, from the very beginning, God says, you have less power, you have less authority, you have less say. For egalitarians, the question is the exact opposite. Well, okay, you say that men and women are different. How can they be different when they do all the exact same things in everything except childbirth? There's no difference in their vocations. There's no difference in, any of that stuff, in how they work in the world. And to my satisfaction, neither party has answered their foundational question. And there are other questions that each of these warring parties can't answer. But what Lee Barnwell wants you to see is that this discussion has been about authority and equality. And what she argues is those are not the primary concerns of the New Testament. So what are the kingdom principles she wants us to be thinking about? Well, there's 3 of them. You remember I told you there's those values of the Roman household? Order, stability, and honor. Well, what are these 3 values? Notice what they are. Unity, inclusion, and reversal. And they're intimately related to each other. Notice that reversal word. That might be the only one you need to have sort of explained to you. That's the upside down nature of the kingdom thing. Yes, it is the fact that God demands that those who are going to lead must serve first. And that service must be the pathway that they take to leadership. Frankly, in my upbringing, that should have been emphasized more. Because I was somebody who wanted to lead first. I've always wanted to be the leader. The one making the decision. The one where the buck stops with me. I've always wanted to be. I should have had that emphasized much more. But then there's this other part of divine reversal too. It is that God tends to use the people you don't think He's going to use. Right? Okay? And here's the weird part, okay? The Romans think that they're going to establish unity with this order, with this regimented structure, with the guy at the top, the head, doing his thing and protecting himself. Lee Barnwell rightly shows that in Roman society, the head was not supposed to love the inferiors. Because love, everybody understood, meant self-sacrifice. The head was supposed to show mercy to the inferiors. What does Paul say? He says, husbands, love your wives. Right? He's already flipped that script on its head. And why does he do it? Because in Paul's overall thinking, and this is right in line with what we've been studying in Ephesians, right? In Paul's overall thinking, when we subordinate ourselves, when we lower ourselves, when we serve one another, that's what creates unity. Not maintaining the hierarchies. Okay? So, I think there is much to be said for what Lee Barnwell wants us to do. I think there is much to be said for reframing this conversation. Nevertheless, I don't think we can sidestep the questions, the hard questions. I'm not going to go through all those questions on the screen, by the way. I'm just putting them up there so you can see them and see what some of these questions are that we need to wrestle with, that we need to think about. Now, why can't we sidestep these questions? Well, for one thing, because notions of authority and equality are found in the New Testament. They are present there. There are issues that need to be resolved. For example, at the end of Acts 10, when the Holy Spirit comes on everybody in Cornelius' household, before anybody's made a public profession of faith or been baptized, the Holy Spirit comes, and what does Peter say? He says, now I realize that God is impartial. So we have to wrestle with it from that point of view. That is, from the point of view of the Scriptures. But we also have to wrestle with these questions as Tish Harrison Warren pointed out in her review of Michelle Lee Barnwell's book. We have to answer these questions, or at least address them, at least acknowledge them, because of our own history. Whatever else you believe, wherever you come down about what the Bible teaches, it is inescapable that much of what the church has said and done has been sexist. There's just no getting around that word. It has been sexist. I love this story. I've watched this happen and nearly fell out of my chair laughing. So James K.A. Smith is a very good philosopher and Augustine scholar. And he came to the Trinity Forum in one of their little things that they do to address them about his newest book about Augustine and spirituality. And at the end of his talk, Cherie Harder sat down with him. She herself is a Harvard University grad. She's really bright. And her first question was to him, Jamie, why should I entrust my soul to somebody who isn't sure that I have one? Augustine, at times, had very negative portrayals of women, including sometimes questioning whether they really had a soul. And Augustine wasn't the only one. There were other church fathers who had similarly demeaning things to say about women. What do we do with all of that? That's why these questions of authority and equality, matter. And that's why we can't sidestep them. So now we're going to move on. We've got the context in front of us, and now we're going to start looking at Ephesians And looking at Ephesians is going to help us do what Lee Barnwell wants us to do and reframe our conversation without forgetting about the questions that history demands we think about. Let us pray.